I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the board of the Princeton Adult School. My name is Ingrid Reed, and I'm on the lectures committee. And a lot of you probably know that we take turns doing introductions. And tonight, I'm glad to be standing in for Cy Marchand because he is fine after having hip surgery, but he didn't think he could maneuver this room and do the introduction tonight and pay tribute to Alan Kruger, who not only is our first lecturer, but was very helpful to us in giving us advice about how to put this program together, and Cy was the contact with Professor Kruger. So I'd like to give credit where credit is due. I'd also like to remind you that we are very pleased with the response to this lecture. We have enough seats tonight, but we are very gratified that there was so much interest in this lecture series that we are sold out. And so you might just remember that on another night if it's not raining, be sure and get here early if you have a favorite seat or a favorite parking space. Also, let me remind you that there is a lecture next week on the 18th, but there is not one on the 25th due to the university's midterm break. So I think I have now paid tribute and given you the announcements, and now I can introduce the first lecture of this series, which we've entitled Money Talks. And that's a very ambiguous title. You can decide how you want to interpret that. Does money talk and say what we value? Is money the only thing that talks when we should think of others? But basically, we wanted to introduce economics and public policy and to give economists a chance to tell us about their thoughts and their work that isn't just mathematical formulas, as important as they are in understanding how our economy works and the rigor that's brought from good statistical analysis. And our speaker tonight exemplifies the competencies in all of those areas. In fact, Professor Kruger just told me that he's teaching statistical analysis, and I know you're all going to get nervous when I say that, to the first-year graduate students in the Woodrow Wilson School. He is the Bentheim Professor of Economics and Public Affairs, which means that he has an appointment in both the Economics Department and in the Woodrow Wilson School. He is also the founding director of the Princeton University Survey Research Center, a quite innovative approach in higher education today. And it's flourishing and is a model for other centers of that kind. He is also the co-editor of the European Economics Association Journal and is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a prestigious organization in Boston. Obviously, a person of Professor Kruger's stature has a very long resume. In fact, it's 16 pages, and you would not expect anything else. So the introducer gets to pick out just a few things that are particularly interesting, and I've already done that to some extent and highlighted his current work. I should say that he also has been, as we say, in the real world, and was at the Department of Labor the chief economist in the mid-1990s. He also obviously has won awards and fellowships and grants. And I picked out the fact that he was an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has a Hewlett Foundation grant to study well-being, did study well-being with Daniel Kahneman. And if you're a reader of the New York Times, you know that he is the economic scene columnist for the New York Times, and he's been doing that since March 2000. If you're looking for new books that are coming up and they go in the direction of good academic research, he has a new book coming out that connects up with his interest in European economics. The Market Comes to Education in Sweden, an evaluation of Sweden's surprising school reforms. And I thought, what a good topic for us here in New Jersey as we struggle with some of these issues. He also is the author of a book called Education Matters, and it's a selection of his essays on education. And then I got to the very end, the bottom of the 16th page, and I found my favorite entry. It says he has also developed a web-based questionnaire as an aid for high school economics instruction, comma, Mimeo, Princeton University, 2005. I don't know when somebody's used the word Mimeo since I was in school. And that it's web-based. So I want to thank Professor Kruger and welcome him to start this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for that warm introduction. Mimeo, I know that my wife, who teaches at Princeton High School, makes Mimeos all the time, so I know that the technology still exists. Let me also tell you, if you've come here, if you think you're here to hear Paul Krugman, I'm not Paul Krugman. I hope not too disappointed. Paul is speaking last in this series. I checked into a hotel once for an economics conference. The person behind the desk said, "Oh, we have 3 Krugers staying here tonight. We have Ann Kruger. Ann Kruger is actually now the vice president of the International Monetary Fund. And we have Alan Kruger, that's you, and we have Paul Krugman." Well, you know, quite 3 Krugers. What I'm going to do tonight is talk about work, research I've done in the general area on what the public knows about economics, how it learns about economics, and how those views affect public policy. And somewhere I had some notes. In my folder. Just works better with notes. The motivation for this talk and for this research is that my firm opinion is that politicians do respond to public opinion and public pressure. They also respond to lobbyists and corporations and so on, but I think they ultimately want to be reelected, and that leads them to pay attention to public opinion. And we know relatively little about what affects public opinion when it comes to economic policy. So together with a colleague of mine, Alan Blinder, I've been working to study how individual self-interests affect their public opinion, their view about specific economic policy issues, how their knowledge about issues affects their position on issues, and how their ideology affects their positions. And this is of interest, I think, for a lot of reasons. To an economist, it's of interest because we often model the evolution of economic policy, and we assume that people are well-informed, that they're rational, that they behave out of their self-interest. And I think that's probably not a very good approximation to the way people behave in practice. Turns out, and it won't surprise you too much, that people are poorly informed about many economic matters. On average, actually, people seem to get things about right when it comes to economic facts, but there's a wide dispersion, and there's a large segment of the population that comes across as confused. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about some of those common misperceptions, and then I'll talk about how people get their information about the economy and how that connects to their position on public policy issues. So I first thought I would show you a couple of slides from a survey that was done by the Harris Poll Company for the National Council on Economic Education. Ingrid didn't mention, which is just as well as she didn't, that I am the chief economist for the National Council on Economic Education. I'm in the process of writing a textbook for high school economics students, and this is really a wonderful opportunity to become involved in an organization that tries to further economic education among K-12 students and also in the population at large. So they commissioned a survey which the Harris Poll Company carried out for them. It was a survey of both adults and high school students. And if you're having difficulty reading that, I'll tell you the takeaway. And they asked some basic questions about understanding of economics. This particular question had to do with inflation. And people were asked, what of the following has the greatest risk of losing value due to inflation? Which of the following strategies at a time of inflation? And the correct answer to this question was keeping your savings hidden in a mattress or in a piggy bank. At a time of inflation, if you hold money in cash under your mattress, then its purchasing power will deteriorate. You're better off putting your money in the money market fund or in the stock market, which would tend to rise with inflation. And of course, there's some risk associated with putting money in mutual funds or putting them in the stock market. Those risks aren't greater necessarily when you have a time of high inflation. So it seems to be pretty clear that the correct answer here was that the greatest risk was keeping your savings hidden in a mattress. And 52% of adults were able to identify that as the greatest risk, which is a lot better than the high school students, only 28% of the high school students. But still about half of adults think it's a reasonable thing to keep money hidden under your mattress at a time of high inflation. Maybe this isn't so serious because we've had relatively low inflation since the mid-1980s. On the other hand, there are some signs that inflation is beginning to heat up. I think educating the public about investing their funds or putting it in a bank where it will receive interest so it doesn't, its purchasing power doesn't deteriorate at times of high inflation is important. Another question they asked had to do with the purpose of mutual funds. And here the correct answer is, people were asked why, the question was worded the following. Some people prefer to buy mutual funds rather than stocks in a few individual companies because generally mutual funds, and the correct answer should have been provide more diversification than individual stocks. 44% of adults gave that answer, 15% of the high school students. Now, I can't be too critical of the adults because another answer there is mutual funds guarantee a steadier income than individual stocks, which depends upon how you define risk. So that's kind of not too far off. But even if you add that together with the 44%, if you add the group in red, that's 28%. You still have more than a quarter of adults not understanding the purpose of mutual funds. And the teenagers were just hopeless on that question. I guess one positive way of reading this is the adults learned something over the years. The next question has to do with the basic economic concept of gains from trade. So people were asked, when a person rents an apartment, who benefits from the transaction? Well, when a transaction is voluntary, we tend to think of both sides benefiting. That's why I have a picture in mind in the textbook I'm writing, where someone buying something at a store, and they both say thank you, both the seller and the buyer. You tend to think, well, the seller would only sell it if they receive some benefit from selling it. The buyer will only choose to buy it if they receive a benefit. 64% of adults said both the person renting the apartment and the landlord, but the other 36% didn't understand that both the buyer and the seller benefit from the transaction. The students weren't too far off of the adults, 55%. Then there were some questions related to people's understanding of the way we measure the economy. By the way, as someone who writes for the New York Times, I find this particularly useful because I often forget that much of the audience doesn't understand the jargon that we take for granted when we speak to each other about economic policy. So I think the economics profession itself is responsible for some of the confusion in the public's mind about economics. Anyhow, this question asks, if the real gross domestic product of the United States has increased, which of the following has also definitely increased? And the correct answer is that the amount of final goods and services produced has also increased. 42% of adults gave the correct answer, and just 27% of high school students. Real GDP is a measure of the physical quantity of output in the United States, where we try to adjust for changes in prices over time, we just measure the physical quantity of output. To economists, that's a very clear question, and much of the public is confused when we throw around terms like real gross domestic product. The last one I'll show you has to do with defining budget deficit, an issue which is going to be increasingly important in U.S. Policy. When the federal government's expenditures for a year are greater than its revenue for that year, the difference is known as a budget deficit. Well, 73% of adults got that right. And I have to say, I was a little bit surprised they did so well, because I found that people often confuse deficit and debt. Debt is the accumulated deficit from past years. It's the total amount that we owe. And the deficit is just the addition to the debt in that particular year. And high school students, you'll notice high school students were pretty honest. 28% said they had no clue. 46% understood what a budget deficit is. One of the reasons why I became interested in this particular area is a study that was done by Joel Slemrod, who was a Princeton undergraduate many years ago and now teaches at the University of Michigan. And he looked at data where people were asked, who do you think pays more in federal income taxes? Middle income families or high income families? And the majority believed that middle income families pay a higher proportion of their income in federal income taxes than middle income families. Now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which I think has reasonably accurate figures on this, the comparison is not even close. Remember, we're thinking about the federal income tax. The top 1% of households paid almost a quarter of their income in federal income taxes. The middle 20% only pay 5%. Now, this doesn't include payroll taxes, so you might think, well, this is a little bit tricky because people pay a lot of money, ordinary people. The middle pays a lot of their taxes comes from payroll taxes. But remember, this specifically asked about federal income taxes, and even if you included payroll taxes, you would still find that people at the very top of the income distribution pay a higher share of their income in taxes than do people in the middle. Now, I suspect what happens is that you see a couple of articles in the newspaper which say this very wealthy person paid no money in federal income taxes, a very small amount, and we generalize that to other wealthy people. But in fact, those at the top of the income distribution are paying more, a higher share of their income in taxes than those in the middle, even though there are some who clearly evade the law. Now, this confusion, I think, is one of the reasons why you can explain support for a flat tax. So if you believe that the wealthiest people in American society pay lower share of their income in taxes than the middle, then it makes sense that you would think, well, if we had a flat tax, if everybody paid 20% of their income in taxes, then the rich would be paying more. In fact, it's just the opposite. If we had a flat tax, it would require those in the middle of the income distribution to increase their tax payments. And it would be a tax cut for those at the top. So I think this is an example of how confusion about the way economic policy works affects people's opinions on economic issues. And after I saw this study, I was very interested in trying to learn more about what is it that affects people's positions on public policy issues. So together with Alan Blinder, we wrote a questionnaire to try to learn more about this area. And then we conducted 2 focus groups, which I'd never been involved in a focus group before, so that was quite a bit of fun. We advertised in the Trenton Times. We offered free dinner. It wasn't much. And I think we paid about $10 for people to come in for an hour and discuss with us the way they think on me, to give us some feedback on the questions we were thinking about asking. And that was actually very helpful. I learned a bit about how to redesign the questionnaire based on that. And we came up with a 15-minute questionnaire that we asked in a telephone survey. Ingrid mentioned the Survey Research Center. That's it there on your left. It's right on Nassau Street across from CBS. If anyone's looking for employment as an interviewer, we could always use more help. And that's kind of what our stations look like. We use computers to prompt the interviewer to ask the questions. It's called computer-assisted telephone interviewing. And the CADI system gives you a great deal of control over what you can do in a survey. So you can do experiments where you can ask half the people one question and half another question. You can phrase things differently and see how sensitive your results are. And I'll mention a little bit about that. We did something called a split ballot experiment where we asked one of the questions one way for half the sample and another way for the other half. So we conducted what's called a random digit dialing survey. These are the people who annoy you at home over dinner. Ask you questions. By the way, last night I was at home. About 8 o'clock someone called and said, with the opinion research company, something like that, and I'd like to conduct a survey about the election of Mercer County. And I'm actually going to conduct a survey about the New Jersey governor's election as part of my statistics class. I was very interested in the questions that were being asked. So I said, sure. And then she asked me who I was going to vote for and so on. And then she started saying negative things about some of the candidates. And then I realized this was not a legitimate nonpartisan poll. This was called a push poll. So the first time I had ever been part of one of those kinds of surveys. Anyway, that's at that point I cut off the questionnaire. And what we did was random digit dialing. So the population was drawn at random. If someone has an unlisted number, they can still be in our sample. If they don't have a telephone, however, they're less likely. They're not. We did this work not last spring, but the spring before, between March 28th and June 3rd of 2003, and we interviewed 1,000 people. And the way we designed this questionnaire was we wanted to focus on 5 different policy areas: taxes, federal budget deficit, minimum wage, Social Security, and health insurance. And we wanted to ask questions about their opinion on kind of important public policy issues. For example, at this time, the extension of Medicare to cover drug insurance for outpatient care was being debated. It passed shortly afterward. It passed in November of 2003, so that was one of the hot issues that we were interested in. Also, the second Bush tax cut was being debated at this time, which was another of the issues we were interested in. And what we tried to do was to ask some factual questions that connected to these policies, and also collect information about what we think would be individual self-interest. And also collect information about their ideology and their demographic background. So I'll go into some more detail. Another thing we did, because we were idealists when we got started, was we wanted to learn, we were particularly interested in, if knowledge matters to the public, where would you reach the public? How would you find them? Unfortunately, most Americans don't come to adult education programs like this, where they would learn about economics and other fascinating, important subjects. So the question is, where would we reach them? So we had questions about their sources of information. The questionnaire worked as follows. We started with questions about economic policies and facts. So for example, we asked, and we only asked this for half. This is one of those split ballot questions. For half, we said roughly what size, and then we gave a clue here, in billions of dollars, is this year's federal budget deficit. Do you think the federal budget deficit ought to be reduced? For the other half, we actually told them the size of the federal budget deficit, which at that time was around $300 billion. And then we asked, do you think the federal budget deficit should be reduced? So after a series of questions like these, we said, next, we'd like to know how important it is for you to keep well informed about major economic policy issues, such as the ones we've just been discussing. You say it's extremely important, very important, somewhat important, not very important, but not important at all. And the reason why we do things in this order is when people hear about, my experience has been, when people hear about economics, they instantly think about the stock market. I have to say I hate it when my parents' friends find out I'm an economist and they say, well, I think it's a good time to invest in the stock market. I have no insight into that question, and I have to say the only insight I have is anyone who says they have insight into that question is not really being honest. But I think economics deals with much more important questions about how people should arrange their work in a non-work time, what types of career decisions they should make, and the kinds of public policy issues that we were interested in. So after we asked the questions about interest, and this kind of set the scene for what we meant by economic issues, we then asked what types of sources do they use for their, to get information about the economy and economic policy, and then questions about their background and political views, or general political views. So the good news, maybe the best news that we found, is that most people would like to be informed. So when we asked how important it is for you to keep well informed about major economic policy issues, 24% said extremely important and 50% said very important. So 3/4 of American adults think that it's very important or extremely important to keep well informed. Only 3% said not very important and not important at all. That might be the best news that we found in this research. In terms of who wants to be informed, we found relatively little differences by race, age, sex, and income. Political views. We collected information on whether they were self-described liberal, which was 15% of the sample, conservatives, 29%, moderate, 19%, and to our surprise, the biggest group were people who said, I haven't thought about it very much. That was a third. And this matched up reasonably well with other surveys. Most other surveys don't ask in quite the same way. People are not given an opportunity to say, haven't thought about it much. And I think one of the reasons why America can swing in different elections is because there is a big group which is not firmly committed to one political view or another. 4% said other. Some said socialist, some said libertarian. It was kind of interesting to see what the interviewers wrote down. I guess it's good news that those who said that they voted also say that it's more important to be informed. On the other hand, when people say they vote, you're not sure whether you can trust what they say. 68% of the people in our survey said they voted in the last presidential election, when only 51% of people actually did vote. Now, it's possible that we overrepresented people who actually voted, but this is a typical kind of finding in population surveys that people give what they think is the civic answer, the responsible answer that they actually voted. So we asked how frequently do people use different sources of information to learn about economics and economic policy. And this won't be too surprising. Television came out number one. Far and away television. 61% said that they regularly watch television to learn about economic policy. 30% said occasionally. That was followed by newspapers, and I'll show you in a moment. Newspapers actually means local newspapers. This was quite an eye-opener to me. It dawned on me that I would probably have much more influence if instead of writing for the New York Times economics team column, I wrote a syndicated column for local newspapers. Friends or relatives, 35% said regularly, 42% occasionally. Political leaders, 35% said regularly. Then the radio. So the radio isn't as high as you might think, as you hear about the influence of talk radio and so on. Economists, 17% said regularly. By the way, 1 in 6 of the people who said economists volunteered, we didn't even prompt them, they volunteered Alan Greenspan. Which made us rethink a little bit about the way we asked this question, because presumably Alan Greenspan doesn't come over to their house and share they're seeing him on television. But I guess what's kind of focal in people's minds is that they are learning about policy from Alan Greenspan, not economics from Greenspan, not from television itself. The internet was 21%. And I have to say, I was surprised that the internet came in so low, because people use the internet regularly. You'll see in a moment that there is a cadre of people who uses the internet very intensively. But across all people, only 21% said that they regularly use the internet. Now also, because we were doing this and we tried to keep the survey to 15 minutes, we didn't get into detail about whether they're reading the newspaper on the internet. There's a little bit of ambiguity in the way we collected these data. Business leaders was 12%. Civic or religious leaders, 10%. I added this because Rush Holt mentioned to me that often when he visits, particularly black churches, there's discussion about public policy and economic policy, so I thought that would be interesting to add. Magazines was 12%. And we asked about books because it came up in the focus group. One gentleman who came to the focus group said, I just finished reading a book by Bob Shiller suggesting that the stock market's going to crash. And boy, was he right. I'm really glad I followed his advice. Next time you see him, please thank him for me. So we added books, but you can see most people don't regularly learn about economics or economic policy books. After we collected that information, we read back to people, okay, you said that the following 3 or 4 or 2, whatever it was, sources were ones that you regularly use. Which is the most important to you? So here we try to get them to choose among their sources. And you can see television is far ahead of newspapers. Almost half of the people said television was the most important source. Then 19% said newspapers. And here you see the internet rises to 10%. And radio also rises. It's 4th on the list now. And regrettably, economists fall to second to last. So this is not terribly surprising. Although when we probed into newspapers, I found the results quite surprising. What we did was we broke down the sample among liberals, conservatives, moderates, and those who said they haven't thought about it much. So looking at liberals, say, 23% of liberals said they read the New York Times, which I found rather stunning. Only 3% of conservatives said that they read the New York Times. And moderates are in between at 9%. That haven't thought about it group doesn't read very much other than their local newspaper. Wall Street Journal, it reverses. 5% of liberals say they read the Wall Street Journal, 10% of conservatives. So it's not clear from these data whether people become liberal because they read the New York Times, or whether they're already sorting. I have a strong presumption that there's sorting taking place. Then you can see the Washington Post, USA Today. USA Today is pretty much across the board. So there's 8% of liberals, 7% of conservatives, 12% of moderates. Other big city newspapers, and we gave them examples like the Boston Globe or the San Francisco Chronicle. I don't know, and this is one of the shortcomings in the way we collected these data, if someone read the Trenton Times, what they would say, whether they would count that as a big city newspaper. I guess it depends whether you think Trenton is a big city or a local newspaper. But what really leaves attitude here is local newspapers. 44% of liberals said that they regularly read local newspapers, 55% of conservatives, 56% of moderates. And those who haven't thought much about what their political ideology is, by far, they read the local newspapers, 56%. Okay, so people didn't realize this when we did this questionnaire, but we actually gave them a quiz. I think if we said, hi, I'm calling from Princeton University, we'd like to give you a quiz about what you know about economics. Would you mind giving us your next 15 minutes? They'd all say no. So we sprinkled in some questions we call the knowledge questions. And here are 7 of the most important ones. We asked what share of income the typical American family pays in taxes. Don't worry, I'm not going to collect your answers, but you might think about the answers to these. What answer you would give. We asked whether most people pay more taxes in payroll or income taxes, the size of this year's federal budget deficit, the level of the federal minimum wage, the size of the average Social Security benefit check. This was just before, or a few months before, the extension of Medicare passed to cover outpatient drugs. So we asked whether Medicare currently covered prescription drugs for outpatients. And in fact, well, that was what we asked. And then we also asked, what % of Americans do you think do not have health insurance? Okay, so I hope you wrote down your answers. Some of these are difficult to answer. I have to say, we agonized over the correct answer to the share the typical family pays in taxes. So the way, if I were designing a survey for economists, I would say, what fraction of GDP is paid in taxes? And the answer to that is 28.4%. That's from 2002. It's a little bit lower now. Let me look up the latest number. But in 2002, which would have been the latest data when we did the survey, the correct answer was 28.2%. On the other hand, we didn't think it was really fair to ask people about GDP, and there are probably a lot of taxes that go into GDP that they don't know about, so we asked about the typical American family. So if you think about the typical American family doesn't pay the corporate income tax, which is a big share of taxes in GDP. So what we computed to get the 23.3% figure is the share of personal income that's paid in income taxes. We included the employee's contributions in payroll tax, but not the employer's contribution. So there are a couple ways of interpreting the answers to the question. I'll go question by question. For the tax share, the average respondent said 31%, which is a bit high, I would say. Although it's not high if you compare it to taxes as a percent of GDP. It's still a little bit high, but not particularly high. I report here the standard deviation, which is a measure of how much dispersion there is. Not everybody reported exactly 31.3%. There was a bit of a range, and the standard deviation gives a sense of how much range. And the range was quite wide. The range was 15.6%. I won't bore you with the details of how you calculate the standard deviation, but that's a fairly large amount of variability. The median is the person right in the middle. So you sort people by their answers and you find the person right in the middle. Half are below the median, half are above the median. The median was 30%. Which is bigger, the payroll tax or the income tax? Well, if you add together the employer and the employee share of the payroll tax, the contest isn't close. For 83% of American tax filers, they pay more in payroll taxes than they pay in income tax. Now maybe it's a little bit unfair to add together the employer share and the employee share, but if you look at just the employee share, just the part of the payroll tax that employees pay, 53% of tax filers, they pay more money in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. But 52% of the people we surveyed said that the income tax was larger. The size of the federal budget deficit, I should tell you that almost half of the people we asked could not even hazard a guess. By the way, I say that it's not that easy a question, I suppose. But half wouldn't give us a guess. So we're only looking at those who are probably better informed. Half. Well, this is to tell you a little bit about what's going on with American economic policy. When we started our survey, the budget deficit was $246 billion. When we finished, it was $310 billion. Those were the congressional budget office projections the first week of our survey and the last week. So we were kind of lenient when we graded this. We thought we would give them anything within that range. And the average of the half who would venture an answer was $334 billion, which is not too far off. The standard deviation, however, was 739, enormous variability. Half of people said 90 billion or less. The other half said more than 90 billion. So I think once these numbers are so big that people just can't relate to them. To the extent they can relate to them, the median person thinks the budget deficit is a lot smaller than it actually is. Although I suspect to the median person, $90 billion is still an enormous deficit. The level of minimum wage, people did reasonably well on this. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage was $5.15 when we did our survey. Some states have a higher minimum wage. We asked specifically about the federal minimum wage. And if someone said, I don't know the federal minimum wage, but I know in California, the state minimum wage is, whatever it was then, it was around $6. We would note that, so we could keep track of that later on. Because you'll see we graded their answers. We'll come to that. The average answer was $5.86, which isn't too far off, and there wasn't that wide dispersion. The size of the average Social Security check, I had to contact the Social Security Administration to find this out. $898. That's what the average check that the Social Security Administration writes for retirees is. The average person in the survey said $824, which isn't too far off. Median said $800, which is just a little bit low. There's a reasonable amount of variability in people's answers. But I think when you ask, not so surprisingly, when you ask about aspects of economic policy that most people can relate to, or many people can relate to, you get more reliable answers, or answers that are closer to the actual, what was the actual case. The Medicare drug benefit. Well, the good news is that a majority of people recognize that Medicare did not already cover prescription drugs for outpatient care. The bad news is it wasn't a big majority, just 54%. And remarkably to me, if you look at people over age 55, a quarter said yes, they think it already covers prescription drugs. Then percent without health insurance. The correct answer is 15.6%. Americans don't have health insurance at this point in time. The average person in the survey said 37%, so they came in very high. The median person said 35%. And that's something I'll come back to. So we graded their answers. I won't tell you exactly how we signed the points, but it was using the sensibly. We're both teachers, so we feel we're capable of assigning grades to each person's answers. So we gave each person that we interviewed, each of the 1,000 people, a knowledge score. And you can see they kind of look like a bell-shaped curve. We normalized it so it should have an average close to 50. It have an average of 43. Not too many people get every question exactly right, but they're hard questions. Then we looked at who did better on the test. And what we found was that people who have more education did better on the test. People of higher income If you're above average income, you scored 8.6, above the median income. If you're in the top half of the income distribution, you scored on average 8.6 points higher than those in the bottom half. Political ideology, for liberals, conservatives, and moderates, there was no difference. But we did find that those who said they hadn't thought about it much did 6 percentage points worse. 6 points worse on our test. Those who said they voted scored higher. And I don't believe that this has actually been shown before for economic policy, but for other types of policies, those who vote do seem like they're better informed, which I suppose is a good thing. By demographics, men did a little bit better than the women. Age was somewhat complicated. It looked like a U-shaped relationship. Upside down U-shaped. So middle-aged people did the best. The youngest and the oldest did do as well. And married people did better than people who were not married. How do they do by the source of information that they use? Here we rank it. People who said that the most important source for them is magazines did the best on average. Their score was 53 points. The bad news is only 2% of the sample. Only 2% of people said magazines were the most important source. I take pride in number 2. Those who say economists are the most important source did the second best, but that was only 1% of people. The newspapers comes in third. And business leaders, if you look at the bottom, you have political leaders, that's your most important source. You might be getting hoodwinked. Relatives and friends, and civic and religious leaders. Those did the worst. Television didn't do particularly well. Television was fourth from the bottom. And as I mentioned before, for most people, for the largest number of people, television is the most important source. Now, of course, these numbers are hard to interpret. I'm not going to infer from this that reading magazines improves your economic knowledge over watching television. It may be that the people who would otherwise do well on this type of quiz tend to read magazines. So it might just be picking up the way that people are sorting. But it does say that those who need the most help in terms of understanding economic policy facts, and these were just kind of factual questions, not value-related questions, are watching, a large number of them are watching television. We also looked by the number of sources that they said that they use regularly or often. So you could use no sources. That was 11% of the sample. So, I just don't consult anything to learn about economic policy. Now, they did the worst. So I suppose that's good news. But they didn't do much worse than people said they used 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 sources. I mean, there's an improvement in the test performance with the number of sources people consulted, but it's not that large. And one of the things I take away from this is it's very difficult to educate people about just factual things about the economy. The media, I think, has much less of an influence on us and on our understanding of things and on our views than it's commonly credited for. I wrote a New York Times article a few months ago about a study that was done by 2 professors at Berkeley. And they had a fascinating idea. The Fox cable news channel started in 1996, October of 96. And it spread across the country, this will surprise you, fairly randomly. So what they were able to do was to look at cable markets, look at individual towns, and look at which cable providers were providing services to those towns. Not all of them provided Fox right away. In fact, some of them still don't provide Fox. And then they looked at how the spread of Fox News affected the way people voted. In particular, did it lead to more people voting for President Bush in the 2000 election compared to the fraction who voted for President Clinton in 1996 in those same towns. So they could look at how votes shifted. And what they found, and I think the results were pretty compelling, that Fox had no impact. And another thing which they found, which is quite interesting to me, I hadn't expected, if you look at the ideological breakdown of who watches Fox News, it tends to be both liberals and conservatives. And what I suspect happens is people watch Fox News and they come away more convinced in their views, whatever it was. But they also look at whether you were more likely to vote. And they didn't find any increase in turnout Professor Fox was adopted earlier. So one of the things I take away, that's why I said I was less cynical when I got started, is that it's very hard, I think, for people to learn about economic policy and public policy more generally to change their political view because of what goes on in the media. So let me talk about our analysis of public opinion. What we tried to do was to relate their position, people's positions on various issues. For example, do you support another tax cut? Do you think the budget deficit should be reduced? Would you favor raising the minimum wage? Do you favor the idea of taking Social Security and making personal accounts from it? Do you support universal health insurance? And if I have time, I'll go through each of those questions, but I want to give you an initial summary because I don't have time. We took each of those questions and we said, what do we find that's related to people's positions on these questions? In particular, is it their knowledge, either general knowledge about economics or specific knowledge about aspects of economic policy related to those issues? Is it their education? Is it what we take to be their self-interest? So for example, if you consider another tax cut, the second round, actually I think the way we asked it was making the first tax cut that passed permanent. So the first tax cut provided much greater benefits for those in higher income brackets. If you only consider narrow self-interest, it would be in the self-interest of wealthier individuals to support making the tax cuts permanent. So for each of these issues, we tried to identify what would be in individual self-interest. And then we had measures of ideology, which was that breakdown I showed you earlier about liberal, conservative, or moderate. And this table summarizes what we found. If you see asterisks, that means it looks like we found something important. If you see asterisks, it looks like that those variables matter by more than just chance. Ideology matters uniformly, or almost uniformly. Liberals are able to find the liberal position on issues. Conservatives are able to find a conservative position. They seem quite good at that. And that seems to override most of the other variables that we think should matter. This model that we have in mind of economic man, of people being self-interested, acting non-ideologically, just out of furthering their own self-interest, doesn't do particularly well. For most of the policies, we don't find that people, what they state as their public opinion, as their views to pollsters, is consistent with what would be in their self-interest. Knowledge sometimes matters, sometimes doesn't. And the way we report here that the signs here, positive or negative, is whether being more knowledgeable makes you more supportive. So let me walk you through some of these results, and then when I get to 9 o'clock or 5 after 9, I'll be happy to stop and take some questions. So we first asked, this is trying to get at people's views about the structure of taxes. Do you agree or disagree with the statement that higher income households should pay a larger share of their income in taxes than lower income households? 58% agreed. 37% disagreed. Only 5% were neutral or didn't know. So what I take away from this is a majority of Americans, reasonably large majority, does believe in progressive income taxation. Does believe in the idea that people who have a higher ability to pay should pay a higher share of their income in taxes. Which, if the tax code is progressive, you would think a majority of people would not favor a flat tax. Do you think taxes in the United States are generally too high, too low, or about right? This might be a leading question. Since the Revolutionary War, Americans have thought taxes are too high. 60% said too high, 35% about right, and only 3% said too low. So then we had this question about their view on public policy, which is the one that we wanted to model here. We wanted to try to understand what leads people to support the second Bush tax cut. We asked Congress passed a series of income tax cuts that were scheduled to take effect over a period of 10 years. President Bush has now proposed that these tax cuts should become effective immediately. Do you favor or oppose that idea, or do you have no opinion? 43% favored and 26% opposed, 31% said no opinion. So what did we find? When we tried to study that particular question, we found that self-interest had little effect. And here we took as an important measure of self-interest people's income. Because if you were in a higher income tax bracket, you stood to gain more from making a tax cut, speeding it up and making it permanent. Yet we didn't find this statistically significant relationship. What we found looked like it just could have occurred by chance. General knowledge mattered. People who were generally more knowledgeable about economic facts were less supportive of the Bush tax cut. I have to tell you that was my position. On the other hand, even those who were in the top quarter on our knowledge quiz were split evenly, 50-50 in favor of the next round of tax cuts. Those who were in the bottom quarter in our knowledge quiz were almost 3-to-1 in favor of making the tax cut permanent. Not so surprisingly, people who thought taxes were too high were more supportive of speeding up the tax cut. And then their general, and here we call it specific ideology. Specific ideology was, do you think the taxes should be higher for those with higher incomes? That seems to matter. If you thought taxes should be higher for those with higher income, you were more likely to oppose the tax cut. But what really dominated here was whether you identified yourself as a liberal or a conservative. Let me switch now to talk about the deficit. I have this so that it'll remind Ingrid of New York. This is the debt clock in 26th Street or something like that. Okay, so here we had a split ballot. I found this really interesting. For half the people, we asked them how big the deficit was. And I already told you that the median person said 90 billion. Most people wouldn't even hazard a guess, but the median person who did said 90 billion. For the other half, we said this year's federal budget deficit is approximately. Oh, by the way, I remember when we wrote this question. Alan Blanger said to me, "They're really scared of you think the deficit's a problem." So we sat down and we wrote, this year's federal budget deficit is approximately $300 billion. This works out to around $3,000 per household. Now, what really amazed me is for the half of people we told what the deficit was, half of them thought the deficit was a serious problem when we asked them that. For the other half, who we didn't tell what the deficit was, 59%. So they're more likely to think the deficit's a problem if you don't tell them how big it is. And the only thing I can think of is people said, you know, $3,000 per household, that's not too different than my credit card debt right now. It's not that big a deal. Now, of course, 50% did still say it was a serious problem. But I have to say I found this rather disheartening because it suggests that if more people learn the size of the deficit, they might come away thinking, well, it's not such a big deal. By and large, however, even if you do tell them, people aren't concerned about the deficit. And this is one of the findings in our study, which I think gives me some hope for the future of economic policy, that we'll have a more rational basis for economic policy, that we'll return to a more responsible footing when it comes to our fiscal policy, because a lot more people think the budget deficit is a serious problem than think it's not a problem at all. The breakdown on this question by ideology was absolutely amazing to me. If you look in 1995 at a survey that was done by Gallup, what was found was that conservatives were much more concerned about the deficit. If you asked the same question in 2003, 72% of liberals say the deficit is a serious problem, only 44% of conservatives. So there's been an enormous switch. I mean, I saw this and I thought, oh my God, Herbert Hoover would roll over his grave. So ideology matters a tremendous amount, but it is situational. It does change the way that ideology relates to people's positions on particular issues. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's rather remarkable that we saw this. So then we went on to ask, for those who said they thought that the deficit should be reduced, which was 88% of the sample. So that's another kind of positive thing that we found. A vast majority of Americans think that the federal deficit should be reduced. Do you think the deficit should be reduced mostly by raising taxes, mostly by cutting spending, or about equally by both means? Americans like the idea of both. I mean, they certainly don't want to raise taxes because 62.7%, said raising taxes. 39% thought that you could do it all by cutting spending. 41% said both. So what that suggests to me is kind of as a political way forward is trying to have kind of a budget summit or having some kind of compromise, which includes both raising revenues and cutting spending, which is, of course, how the deficit came under control in the 1990s. We asked a similar kind of question about addressing the Social Security deficit, the actuarial deficit of Social Security. And again, most people, or the strongest support, was for both raising payroll taxes and cutting spending. Although you see, there are some people who think you can do it all just by cutting spending. So we did an analysis of their answers to this question about how should we proceed to reduce the deficit. So this is studying those who said that they think the deficit should be reduced, which is the vast majority of people. And here we do find that self-interest points in the right direction, or at least we think it's in the right direction, but it's not a very strong effect. So if you're a lower income person and you benefit a lot from government services, you probably don't want to cut spending. It's probably not in your self-interest to cut spending. And if you're a higher income person, it's probably not in your self-interest to lower the deficit by raising taxes, so it'll probably fall much more on you. And our result pointed in the right direction, but it was not overwhelming. People who did better on the knowledge score were less favorably disposed to using taxes. And other than that, the only thing that mattered was ideology. Okay, the minimum wage. You'll see why I use this picture in a moment. Do you think the federal minimum wage should be increased? 3/4 of respondents said yes. The minimum wage is a very popular policy, and when we have a period when the minimum wage hasn't increased for a while, as we're in now, you get even more public support for a minimum wage increase. 21% said no. Then we added this question. By the way, you can see why I had the picture. It's from the cover of the book I have with David Hart, who teaches at Berkeley. We have a book on the effects of the minimum wage on employment, which reaches the surprising conclusion that economists have overrated the impact of minimum wage increases on employment losses. And I think most people agree with us. Do you think that increasing the minimum wage by 50 cents an hour would cost a lot of people their jobs, some people their jobs, or hardly anyone their jobs? And the largest group said hardly anyone, which is what I would have answered. That was 55%. So this kind of gets at people's, we couldn't do this for most of the questions, but it gets at people's understanding or beliefs about how the economy works. Then we tried to understand support for a minimum wage increase, and here everything worked like a charm. If everything was like the minimum wage, economists would have, or we would think our models are just a tremendous success. Our models of people's positions in terms of public policy. If you think that the minimum wage is higher than it actually is, or you think that it will have a lot of job loss, then you're not very supportive of the minimum wage increase. And I suspect this is why advocates who oppose minimum wage increases, lobbyists for minimum wage employers, tend to argue that you're going to have a recession if you have a minimum wage increase, but you're going to have a lot of job losses. Ideology matters a lot. Self-interest seems to matter. Lower income people were more supportive of a minimum wage increase, although even among highly educated, high income people, support was very strong for a minimum wage increase. And we did find that the general knowledge score didn't matter for the minimum wage. Let me turn next to Social Security. At this time we asked, are you aware that President Bush has proposed that part of Social Security be replaced by personal investment accounts? And you might think this is a bit of a leading question. Kind of remarkable to me at this time, since it was an issue in the presidential campaign. 44% said no, I didn't know that. So we kind of took these results as saying, well, this is a bit of a blank slate. And I wouldn't be surprised that all of the president's advisors told him the same thing. That you have an opportunity to persuade the public because they really don't know much about your proposal. Then we said, do you favor or oppose this idea? After we told them that the idea was on the table, 20% said they favored it, 38% said they opposed it, and the largest number said they were undecided because they had never thought about it before. So the way we read this at the time was that there was some scope for the president to persuade the country to support personal accounts under the Social Security bill. What else did we find? Well, self-interest mattered to some extent. We found that higher income people, younger people, higher educated, you could argue whether that's self-interest, they were more supportive of personal accounts. And I think the one that kind of jumped out at me was the younger group. We had another self-interest question, which didn't occur to me to ask. In fact, I don't know if any other survey has ever asked this. We asked towards the end of the question, do you have any parents who are still alive? And the reason why we did this is if your parents are still alive, you tend to benefit a lot more from Social Security than if you have no, if your parents are deceased because your parents are drawing benefits. So you have more of a stake in the current system. This was, I thought, a really clever idea. It was Alan Blander's idea. It didn't matter at all. It didn't predict their position at all. Whether they're aware of the president's proposal didn't matter. We asked whether they expect Social Security to be a major source of retirement income for them. And that mattered quite a bit. I think I wrote this backwards. If you thought Social Security was going to be a major source of retirement income, you were more supportive. Sorry, you were less supportive of personal accounts. You were more supportive of maintaining the current system. And we found a huge effect of ideology on this question. Now that might have been because we mentioned the name Bush. And maybe in that particular question that people just kind of affiliated with the president or it made them was revolting to them. So let me next tell you about universal accounts, and I think this is the last one. Do you favor what is called universal health insurance coverage? Universal life accounts and health coverage. Do you favor what is called universal health insurance coverage, meaning that the government would make sure that every American is covered by a health insurance policy? We didn't specify how you would do it. We didn't have 1,400 pages of healthcare law. 71% favor the idea. 23% oppose it. She found it remarkable to me that there's still such strong support for universal health insurance. Interestingly, 15.9% of our respondents lacked health insurance, which is almost spot on what it was in the country at that time. It was 15.6% at that time, which made me feel pretty good about our survey. We were able to replicate what we find nationally. We also asked, do you have family members who don't have health insurance? 9% said that they have a family member who lacks health insurance. So for these 25% of the population, we thought it's in their self-interest to support universal health insurance because it would lead to coverage for them or for their family members. What did we find? Well, when we tried to model support for universal health insurance, we found that the low income and those who were uninsured themselves were more supportive of universal health insurance. However, if you have a family member who doesn't have health insurance, that didn't seem to matter for your position. So people were self-interested, but it was a very narrow self-interest. Ideology mattered. Liberals were a lot more supportive of universal health insurance than conservatives. General knowledge was irrelevant. But here we found something that I found rather disconcerting from my perspective, which is if you think a higher share of people lack health insurance, you were more supportive. So if you recall, it was about 37% on average. So the average person, the average person thinks about 37% of people lack health insurance. But the truth is about 15%. So the average person grossly overestimates the size of the problem. If you think the problem is particularly bad, is even a lot worse than it is, then you're more supportive. So one of the things this suggests to me, if we have an education campaign to say 15 in 100 Americans lack health insurance, people might think, well, it's not as bad a problem as I thought. I used to think it was 35 or 37, at least implicitly that was what I had in my mind. So this is a case, a little bit like the deficit, where I fear that providing more information may move policy in a direction which is not the direction that I would necessarily favor. Let me just reach some general conclusions. What we find is that people have a strong desire to be well informed. I suppose that's why all of you have stayed so long today. TV is the medium, followed by local papers. It's the medium by which people learn about economic policy and economic facts. The knowledge that people have is imperfect, but it's not terrible. I actually expected that we would see even greater errors in people's perceptions when we got started. Knowledge is better among those who receive more information, or at least a little bit better, and higher among those who have more education. When we try to model people's positions on economic policy issues, we find that ideology is really important. Their ideology and their beliefs about progressivity of income taxes, for example, really matter. Their general knowledge and their education is much less important. Their objective self-interest matters a lot less than we might have expected. Then we have two possible explanations for why. One is that people are just confused. They don't understand what is in their self-interest. And it's very difficult for economists to say that we know better what's in someone's self-interest than they actually know. But political scientists say that all the time. My colleague Larry Bartels did a study on support for the estate tax cut. And he concluded that the only way you can explain the pattern of support for the estate tax cut is what he called unenlightened self-interest. So we put him in the confusion camp. The second explanation has to do with generosity of spirit. These are not necessarily mutually consistent. People care about the Commonwealth. They care about improving the country. They might care about that more than their own self-interest. That's why we call it generosity. They differ, however, in how to advance the public good. And that's what we're picking up when we look at the effects of ideology. They have different views about what's in the public's interest. They're not driven by their own narrow self-interest. They're driven by their vision of what's in the public's self-interest, in the public's interest. They just have different views about how to improve things. And people are quite good at using clues to find the position that people with a similar ideology take. They're quite good at finding a position that someone who shares their worldview about how to improve American society, economic policy, and so on, about what type of position they would take. And in that sense, I think ideology provides clues, and people are quite good at finding those clues and reading the tea leaves and taking a position which most people who share their worldview also take. So I'm happy, at this point I've gone a little bit longer than I had intended, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir?
I was surprised that available income didn't come in rather than income. But if somebody spends everything they have nothing left over. And in some of those questions.
I guess I'm a little bit confused. What we were doing, what we used was their
about
gross
net
income.
income?
No. We're looking at their total income that they earn,
Right.
not at their savings.
Right. But if you spend on essentials everything you earn, you don't have any net income.
Well,
Do people understand that?
Well, I think they do understand what a government deficit is, so I think they probably understand a personal deficit. But it's quite common when you say income that what you mean is gross income. You know, the income that you've earned either from working on a job, which is how most people make their income, or from investments or other property that they might own.
I tend to think of net income.
I hope you're the exception. Yes, ma'am.
When you asked the question about the deficit and framed it that there was $3,000 a year, and you said, well, maybe people think that's credit card debt, so it wasn't so bad. I think there might have been a confusion in people's mind between deficit and debt. If you told them what their actual share of the debt was, which I think is now close to $60,000,
Yeah,
there might have been a
75.
different, I mean, was that factored in at all?
No, and that may well be what happened.
Response?
That may just be reflecting confusion. And when we said deficit, they thought this is the total national debt. That's not such a big deal.
Right.
If I were to do this again, I would use the national debt instead of the deficit, because $3,000 might sound like peanuts, and they might not realize it's not like $3,000 this year, it's $3,000 next year, and the year after, and so on. The one thing which makes me think they did understand was in that other survey that I first mentioned, people seem to understand the difference between debt and deficit. 3/4, on that particular question, 3/4 of adults were able to say when the government spends more money than it takes in a particular year, they call that a deficit rather than debt. Now, of course, the quarter were confused, and you know, maybe some of those who got the answer right were just lucky, they were guessing. So it could well be that they were thinking this is the whole national debt, so it's not such a big deal. On the other hand, it was still the case that even for those who we told the size of the deficit that we made it on a per capita basis, which we thought was at a level that they could relate to, half of them said they thought the deficit was a serious problem, and a large majority thought that something should be done about it, that it should be reduced. Yes, sir.
This is going beyond the data, but asking you perhaps to draw a conclusion from it. And I'm in no way expressing a personal belief here. But after the recent flooding in the southern United States, several people suggested that in order to cover that expense, there would be no tax increases, but a deficit increase, and the argument being that a deficit increase will improve economic results, and in turn that increases government income and reduces ultimately both the deficit and the debt. Which of the characteristics of the respondents to your survey might believe that chain of logic?
We didn't ask, are you a supply sider? I was all prepared to address the logic rather than who supported the logic. I actually suspect that in the public, the support for that logic is not particularly strong. I think people are concerned about the deficit. And I think they see from the experience after 9/11 that, you know, 9/11 didn't weaken the economy. We were already in a recession. And I haven't seen any polling of this, but my sense is that support will be pretty strong for canceling out some of the tax cuts because of the damage from the two hurricanes, or delaying the phasing in of the Medicare drug insurance. It's not a direction that the White House and the Congress want to go. But I think one of the reasons why you're seeing so much division in the Congress is they're hearing a lot from their constituents. That they are growing, you know, becoming more and more concerned about the deficit. Yes?
This is almost a follow-up to what he discussed. There was a terrific graphic in the Times last week, I think, on the op-ed page. A graphic designer, I guess an economist, had figured out what expenses, what spending would have to be abandoned in order to pay for estimated costs of Katrina. And it was terrific. Right there, you know, 40 or 50 line items taught me what the trade-offs were.
Right.
In actual programs, most of which I'd never heard of in the first place, defense, subsidies, whatever. And I'm wondering, especially given your emphasis on education, if you have any optimism about our ability to talk to everybody in terms of these trade-offs more regularly. I notice that most of the questions, after all, everybody wants a tax cut, and that's been true for 200 years. Everybody likes universal health coverage. And
Right.
it's
Doesn't add up.
described so simply that it's irresistible
Right.
in both cases. So I'm wondering what you think, especially given that high school book you're writing, if there's a way to communicate those trade-offs to more people. And secondly, I'm wondering what you think about the sort of ongoing battle between a more informed populace with all these media to draw from, and then the more battle-savvy confusers on the other side who seek to prey on their confusion. Is one going to win out? Of course, I'm hoping for the more informed population to win out, but I'm wondering what trends you see on that front.
Right. Well, I have to say I have very mixed feelings. For example, one of the puzzles to economists is why people carry so much debt. The credit card, kind of in an irrational way. Credit card debt, which has very high penalties and high payments, when they have savings which they could use to pay it down, or they could rearrange the mortgage and so on. So one of the things I take away is the Americans really want to deny that there are trade-offs. In economics, we say they like to pretend there's no budget constraint. They want to spend and not worry about having to pay for it. And well, government is just an extension of the way people are in their personal lives. And in fact, if you kind of look at it that way, government's a real big deal for them because they're borrowing at a much lower rate. You know, money that the Treasury raises from Treasury bonds are a much lower interest rate than my credit card. So at one level, what I say is this can't go on forever. There has to be a reckoning where the rest of the world is not going to want to lend us money to pay for our deficit. And at that point, you're going to see interest rates shooting up, and then we're going to have serious problems. I think it was very hard the last few years for economists and public officials or ex-public officials like Barbara Rubin to say, you know, these deficits are going to be a big problem. We're going to have interest rates that are really high. When interest rates were low. And my own sense was that I was really surprised interest rates stayed so low. And also, I have to say, I gave a talk earlier this summer, beginning of last summer, beginning of this summer that just passed. And I said that I think the deficit is a problem, although I can't prove to you that it's caused us serious hardship yet, because it hasn't had that much of an effect on interest rates. But the real serious problem is if we have a disaster. I mean, we're skating on such thin ice that a disaster is over. And I think Katrina was sort of that disaster. You know, what I suspect is going to happen, Paul Krugman did write about this last week. I'm not convinced that the federal government is going to spend all that much on the roads. You know, I think there will be some spending on some contracts which are politically connected. And then there will be a lot of promises that are not delivered on. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's the case when it comes to Katrina. I don't think it's a great solution to the problem. So on the issue about educating the public and kind of how do you sway people's opinions, one of the things I do believe is people care about results. And certainly not everyone, but many people vote their pocketbook. So Americans are pragmatic, and I think that they don't pay much attention to these arguments. In part because they don't understand the terms either. You know, when you talk about real GDP or you talk about the CPI, they just tune it out. And they've got more important things to do in their lives. That I can kind of understand. They don't, you know, I like reading about economic policy, but they prefer to watch baseball or do other things. But if they start seeing that they're paying a price, they'll hold the people in power responsible. I think that is the way that people vote. So I think the more that they see that the economic policy that we pursued, in my opinion, has not left the kinds of results that we should hope for, that'll affect the way that they vote. I don't know they'll become more informed, but I think what will influence them is what they see happening to the job opportunities for the children, to the cost of housing, and so forth. And that's why gasoline prices are resonating so much now. Yes.
What would you say is the more riskier, the national debt or the debt that's accumulated through the trade deficit?
Well, I think they're related. I do think they're related. So, not so much the debt, but the deficit is connected to the fiscal deficit is connected to the trade deficit.
Right, but the national debt are
National debt we already have. I think the national debt is manageable. I think the problem with the national debt is that it's growing at a rate that's not sustainable. But we have to come to terms with that. And I think the sooner we come to terms with it, the better, because there will be some difficult adjustments, and it's better to have them planned out in advance. And this is related to the demographics of the U.S. Do I think that's a more serious problem than the current trade deficit? I think they're related because, you know, I think if we get our current fiscal house in order, that's going to help with the trade deficit.
But the one that would end more drastically, isn't that the trade deficit? Because if it gets to a certain very high point, and the Chinese and the Middle East, and you know, they stop buying the bonds, wouldn't that cause like a catastrophic crash?
That's a risk. That's certainly a risk. I don't think they're gonna. I think more of what will happen is that the interest rates will shoot up. that in order for us to entice them to continue buying the bonds, we're going to have to offer higher and higher interest rates. I don't think they're going to stop selling us goods. Yes, ma'am?
These people who don't understand economics and who don't have facts at their disposal, I'm thinking particularly of young people and the students that you were referring to earlier. Where would you refer them to find out some of that basic information?
My textbook will be down in the
I say I'm to your textbook.
Before then, I think they should read newspapers. You know, I think that they should read. Well, I think they should get a good dictionary too. I mean, I think the first hurdle is to understand the jargon. One of the difficulties, I heard my friend Greg Mankiw said this. Greg Mankiw was the chief economic advisor to President Bush during the election. He left right after the election. And Greg, you may remember, he was the one who was a bit blunt in discussing the gains from trade and gains from outsourcing. And Greg was really put through the ringer for saying, not very tactfully, mind you, but for saying what almost all economists would agree with, that America as a whole probably gains from the opportunity of outsourcing, although I would add that the gains are not evenly shared, and there's some people who suffer losses, and we haven't done enough to help those who suffer losses. Greg didn't say that second part. So he said that there are unambiguous gains for the U.S. economy from outsourcing. And even Dennis Hastert criticized, but he was really taking that to the woodshed. So I heard Greg give a lovely talk a little bit afterward to a group of economists, and he must have felt like this is a safe crack. So he said that the problem he learned in Washington was that there are two languages. There's the language that economists use, and the language that the rest of the world uses. And we run into difficulties because there's some words in common. So we think we understand each other, but we really don't. I think that's part of the problem. I don't think that was the reason why Greg got into trouble for this. But I think that kind of getting a good dictionary, or the web is so good. I have to say, I mean, it's kind of amazing when you come across a word and then you look in Wikipedia or you do a search on the web and you instantly find what the technical definition of it is in pretty clear terms. That's very helpful.
Question, maybe?
Sure. Yes?
Three questions that I'm going to jam in very quickly. The first one is you talked about the different types of local media, that local newspapers that people reference when they're trying to find information about economics. And you also mentioned television. Did you make a distinction between local channels and versus the national channels? And the second quick question I'm going to jam in is, based on the information that you gathered, what strategies would you suggest to engage the media in, or to raise the awareness about economic specific issues? And is there any additional research that we can look up on this particular issue? And finally, did you look at what economic language or particular talking points people were more likely to respond to that gave them that made them more likely to support or oppose a particular initiative?
Okay. We asked about cable versus network television. We didn't ask about local television. And we couldn't cover everything that we wanted to cover. And I have to say, I was actually kind of amazed how little research has been done on how the public gets its information. Just kind of striking, because I thought someone must have done something like this before, so we'll find it. So I can tell you that in our paper, which I'm happy to give you a copy of, there's a breakdown of cable and network television. I think people don't make that much of a distinction. And I think some people it's confusing because I watch ABC, but it's coming on my cable. So they don't know exactly what that means. But there are data that one can look at, not specifically about public policy or economics, sort of about viewership and that type of thing. In terms of strategy, as I said, when I was quite serious about it, I think if I were to start writing a column over again, I would work on a way of syndicating it to local papers. And I think it's a different style of writing. But some local papers, certainly, papers like the Trenton Times and the San Francisco Chronicle have syndicated authors publishing there. And I think that's really kind of by academics. That's kind of an overlooked market if you don't try to educate the public in general. It's probably not as glamorous. And there is an advantage, I think, for the national papers like the Washington Post or the LA Times or the New York Times, because that's what other journalists read, also the local journals. But I think that there's an opportunity in the local area. Then in terms of how you communicate with people, how you influence people, I think the way to do it is to think to the extent that you can describe things in ways that people can relate to, that it makes sense to them, that it's related to their experiences, then there's a chance to reach them. So, in fact, the conservatives were quite good at this until they were no longer worried about deficits. They would say, think about the government like your family. Think about sitting down at the kitchen table. And each month you get in a certain amount of revenue and you have a certain amount of expenditures. And if the expenditures exceed the revenue, then you're in trouble and you have to make an adjustment. And it's irresponsible to keep going on like this. Now, of course, the federal government is different from the family. It can actually print money. Another way out is inflation. Another way out is to print a lot of money. Families can't do that. They print money, they end up in jail. So it's a little bit misleading, I think, to boil some economics down to that level. But I do think that that's kind of the way to try to communicate with people, to try to engage people who ordinarily don't think about economics and ordinarily don't think that they're actually interested in economic policy. Thanks all of you for your